They came across the Mediterranean in ships that groaned and swayed with the weight of war. Men packed shoulder to shoulder in the belly of vessels that smelled of diesel fuel and salt and sweat. The 92nd Infantry Division, the Buffalo Soldiers, moving toward a coastline they'd only seen in reconnaissance photos and briefing maps. Italy, 1944, the Gothic line waiting somewhere in the mountains beyond the beaches. A wall of German fortifications that had already swallowed thousands of Allied lives. But these men weren't thinking about mountains yet. They were thinking about the reception they'd receive. Because even in the middle of a world war, even crossing an ocean to fight fascism, they knew the color of their skin would arrive before their courage ever could. The landing craft hit the beaches near Naples in the summer heat, and the soldiers of the 92nd Division stepped onto European soil for the first time. They carried the weight of their rifles, their packs, their orders, but they also carried something heavier, something that had been placed on their shoulders long before they ever put on a uniform. They carried the doubts of their own country. They carried the whispers that followed them through every training camp in America, every segregated facility, every moment when a white officer looked at them and wondered if they'd run when the bullets started flying. They carried the legacy of every black soldier who'd fought in every American war, only to come home to a nation that refused to see them as equals. And now here they were, in a foreign land, about to prove something they should never have had to prove in the first place. The Italian civilians emerged slowly from their homes in the towns near the coast. Cautiously, the war had taught them to be careful about soldiers, about liberators who sometimes brought as much destruction as the armies they were replacing. They'd seen the Germans retreat north, brutal and efficient in their withdrawal, burning and mining as they went. They'd seen British and American forces arrive, white soldiers who looked at them with a mixture of pity and suspicion. But now, walking through their streets, setting up positions in their piazzas, were soldiers unlike any they'd encountered before. Black soldiers, African-American men in U.S. Army uniforms speaking English with southern drawls and northern clips, laughing and joking and singing as they unloaded equipment and established their lines in a small village outside Naples. An old woman stood in her doorway and watched a young sergeant from Georgia direct his squad to defensive positions around the town square. She'd lived through the First War. She'd buried her husband in 1918. She'd seen Mussolini rise and fall. She'd watched the Germans occupy her village with cold efficiency, but she'd never seen this. Black men wearing the uniform of America's army, moving with discipline and purpose, treating her neighbors with a kindness that surprised everyone. The sergeant noticed her watching and tipped his helmet, called out a greeting in broken Italian he'd learned from a phrase book. The old woman crossed herself and whispered something her granddaughter didn't quite catch. Later, the girl would say her grandmother called them angeli scuri, dark angels. But not everyone saw angels. The American command structure that had sent the 92nd Division to Italy carried with it all the prejudices of Jim Crow America, packaged and shipped across the Atlantic like standard military issue. The division was largely led by white officers, many of whom had never commanded black troops and didn't want to start now. Some believed the racist pseudoscience of the day that claimed black soldiers lacked courage under fire. Others simply resented being assigned to what they considered a second-rate unit. They looked at these men and saw problems waiting to happen, failures guaranteed by genetics rather than circumstance. It didn't matter that the Buffalo Soldiers had served with distinction in previous conflicts. It didn't matter that these men had volunteered, had trained hard, had passed every test put before them. The assumptions were already made. The verdict was already in. Private James Williams from Mississippi had grown up picking cotton in fields his family would never own. He'd seen his father humiliated by white men for the crime of looking them in the eye. He'd attended a school that received textbooks only after the white school across town had discarded them. He'd boarded a segregated train to get to boot camp, where he'd trained to defend a democracy he'd never been allowed to fully participate in. And now he stood in an Italian village, his rifle heavy in his hands, and wondered what kind of war this would be, the kind where courage mattered, or the kind where the color of his skin would be used against him no matter what he did. The answer came soon enough. The 92nd Division was ordered north, toward the Gothic line, toward the mountains where the Germans had dug in deep. The terrain was brutal, all steep ridges and narrow valleys, every hillside a potential killing ground. The Germans held the high ground, and they'd had months to prepare: concrete bunkers, artillery positions with overlapping fields of fire, machine gun nests hidden in caves and farmhouses, minefields that turned the approaches into death traps. The kind of defenses that would test any unit, veteran or green. But when the 92nd Division struggled in their initial assaults, when they took casualties and fell back to regroup, the whispers started immediately. Not that the mission was impossible, not that the terrain was hell. Not that any unit would have struggled under those conditions. No. The whispers said the black soldiers had failed because they were black, because they lacked courage, because they weren't capable of fighting like real soldiers. Lieutenant Thomas Harper, a white officer from Ohio who actually believed in his men, stood in a muddy command post and listened to his superiors discuss the division's performance with barely concealed contempt. They spoke about his soldiers like they were a failed experiment, a waste of resources. He wanted to tell them about Private Williams, who'd crawled through machine gun fire to pull a wounded man to safety. About Corporal Jackson, who'd held a position alone for 3 hours after the rest of his squad had been forced to withdraw. About the medic Thompson, who'd refused to leave the wounded even as German artillery bracketed their position. But he knew it wouldn't matter. The narrative was already set. The 92nd Division was failing, and in the minds of too many commanders, it was because black soldiers couldn't fight. What those commanders didn't see, what they refused to see, was the truth playing out in 1,000 small moments across the Italian campaign. They didn't see the Italian families who opened their homes to black soldiers, who shared what little food they had, who treated these men with a humanity they'd rarely experienced in their own country. They didn't see the children following the soldiers through the streets, laughing and playing, color meaning nothing to eyes that young. They didn't see the Italian partisans who fought alongside the Buffalo Soldiers, who judged them only by their courage and their willingness to bleed for Italy's liberation. They didn't see the bonds forming between black Americans and Italian civilians, connections built on mutual respect and shared humanity. In a farmhouse that had been converted to a aid station, a young Italian woman named Maria worked alongside the division's medics. She'd lost her brother to the Germans, her home to Allied bombing. She had every reason to hate all soldiers, all armies, all the machinery of war. But she found herself drawn to these men in ways she couldn't fully explain. They treated her with respect. They didn't grab at her like some soldiers had. They asked about her family, learned her name, thanked her for her help. And slowly she began to understand something that would stay with her for the rest of her life. These men were fighting 2 wars, one against the Germans in the mountains, another against the prejudice that followed them everywhere they went. And somehow, impossibly, they were still capable of kindness. The war ground on. The Gothic line held. Men died in ways that were senseless and brutal and far too common in 1944. The 92nd Division took casualties and regrouped and went back up those goddamn hills again. They learned the terrain. They adapted their tactics. They became better soldiers through the crucible of combat, the way all soldiers do when they survive long enough. But every mistake was magnified, every setback used as evidence of racial inferiority by commanders who were looking for any excuse to confirm their prejudices. When white divisions struggled, it was the fog of war, the difficulty of the terrain, the strength of the German defenses. When the 92nd struggled, it was proof that black men couldn't soldier. Private Williams crouched in a foxhole on a hillside that didn't have a name, just coordinates on a map. German artillery was walking up the slope toward his position, each explosion closer than the last. Shrapnel wind through the air. The earth shook. He pressed himself into the mud and thought about home, about his mother's face, about the cotton fields that suddenly seemed peaceful compared to this. The barrage lifted. In the terrible silence that followed, he heard the whistle. German infantry coming up the hill under cover of the artillery. He checked his rifle, made sure his ammunition was ready. Beside him, Corporal Jackson did the same. Neither man spoke. They didn't need to. They'd been through this before. They'd die in this foxhole or they'd hold the line. Those were the only 2 options that mattered. The Germans came out of the smoke and dust, field gray uniforms moving in tactical bounds, professional and deadly. Williams fired. Reloaded. Fired again. Jackson's rifle added to the chaos. Machine gun fire from their left flank. Grenades exploding among the advancing Germans. The enemy fell back, regrouped, came again. This time they got closer. Close enough that Williams could see the face of the man he shot, a moment of eye contact before the German went down. He didn't have time to think about that. Didn't have time to be sick or scared or anything, but a soldier doing his job. The second wave fell back. A third didn't come. By the time Lieutenant Harper reached their position 2 hours later, Williams and Jackson were still there, still alive, surrounded by empty cartridge casings and the smell of cordite. Harper looked at them, looked at the German bodies on the hillside below, and knew this story would never be told the way it should be. In the towns and villages behind the front lines, something remarkable was happening. The Italian people, ground down by years of fascism and war, were seeing the Buffalo Soldiers not as the American command saw them, but as fellow human beings. In a society that had been fed Mussolini's racial propaganda, that had been taught to see Africans and black people as inferior, these American soldiers were challenging every assumption. They were disciplined, they were kind, they shared their rations with hungry children, they helped rebuild damaged homes. They treated Italian women with respect that shocked and moved a population that had grown accustomed to the brutal behavior of occupying armies. And slowly, inevitably, connections formed. Romance bloomed in the ruins of war. Black soldiers and Italian women fell in love, a phenomenon that would have been illegal in much of the United States, that would have gotten men lynched in some southern states. But here in the chaos of liberated Italy, love found a way. Dances were held in town squares. Soldiers taught Italian girls to jitterbug. Language barriers were overcome with gestures and laughter and the universal language of young people trying to find joy in the middle of horror. Some of these relationships would last only days or weeks, brief connections in a transient war. Others would endure, would lead to marriages and families and lives built across continents. But all of them represented something profound, a rejection of the racism that said such connections were impossible or wrong, a declaration of humanity that transcended national and racial boundaries. The American military command watched this with growing alarm. Orders came down. Black soldiers were to minimize their contact with Italian civilians. They were to stay in their camps when off duty. They were to understand that their behavior reflected on their race and their country. The irony was lost on no one. These men could die for their country, could bleed and suffer and sacrifice, but they couldn't be trusted to interact with the people they were liberating. Meanwhile, white soldiers faced no such restrictions, no such scrutiny, no such collective responsibility for individual actions. The double standard was as clear as it was cruel. Private Williams sat in a cafe in a small town whose name he could never quite pronounce correctly. Across from him, Maria translated between him and her grandmother, the old woman who'd called the soldiers dark angels. They were talking about food, about family, about the simple things that connected human beings across cultures. The grandmother wanted to know about America, about Mississippi, about Williams's life before the war. He told her about the cotton fields, about the separate water fountains, about the back of the bus. She listened with eyes that had seen too much suffering to be shocked by anything. When he finished, she reached across the table and took his hand. She said something in rapid Italian that Maria translated slowly. She says, "You are a better man than the country that sent you here." She says, "Italy will remember you when America has forgotten." The push continued. The Gothic line had to be broken. Winter was coming and no one wanted to fight through these mountains in the snow. The 92nd Division was committed to another offensive, another attempt to crack the German defenses. They went up those hills again into the machine gun fire and the artillery, into the killing zones that the Germans had crafted with such deadly precision. Men fell, units became separated in the chaos, communications broke down. Some units retreated when they couldn't advance, falling back to regroup and try again. It was the nature of combat, the ebb and flow of battle that every army experiences. But when the 92nd Division fell back, when they took casualties and lost ground, the verdict was swift and damning. The experiment had failed. Black soldiers couldn't fight. The Buffalo Soldiers were broken. General Edward Almond, the division commander who had never believed in his black soldiers, who had blamed them for every setback while ignoring their courage and sacrifice, saw his prejudices confirmed. He spoke to the press, to other commanders, painting a picture of a division that had failed because of the inherent limitations of its soldiers. The stories spread. Back home, newspapers picked up the narrative. The 92nd Division became a cautionary tale, proof that integration in the military was a mistake, evidence that some men were simply not meant to be soldiers. The men of the division heard these stories, read these articles, and felt the bitter weight of betrayal. They'd done everything asked of them. They'd fought and bled and died. And still it wasn't enough. Still the color of their skin mattered more than the content of their character, mattered more than their courage or their sacrifice. But the Italian people remembered differently. In the towns and villages liberated by the Buffalo Soldiers, in the homes that had been treated with respect, in the hearts of the women who'd fallen in love with these American soldiers, a different story was being told. The dark angels who'd come from across the ocean, the soldiers who'd fought with courage and died with honor, the men who'd treated Italians like human beings, who'd shared their food and their laughter, who'd brought joy to places that had forgotten what joy looked like. In the years after the war, monuments would be raised to these men. Streets would be named for them. Italians would speak their names with reverence, would tell their children and grandchildren about the Buffalo Soldiers who liberated Italy with courage and grace. Private Williams survived the war. He made it through the Gothic line, through the final push into northern Italy, through V-Day and the chaos of occupation and demobilization. He sailed home in 1945, back across the Atlantic, back to an America that had barely changed in the years he'd been gone. He was still required to use the colored entrance, still had to sit in the back of the bus, still couldn't vote in his home state of Mississippi. He'd fought for democracy in Europe, had been treated as a hero by Italian civilians, had proven his courage on battlefields that would haunt his dreams for decades, and none of it mattered. He was still just another black man in Jim Crow America. His uniform and his service and his sacrifice meaning nothing to the system that had oppressed him from birth. He settled in a small house outside his hometown, found work where he could, married a woman who'd waited for him through the war. He didn't talk much about Italy. The memories were too painful, too complicated, too wrapped up in the bitter knowledge that he'd been better treated by the people he'd helped liberate than by his own country. But sometimes late at night he'd remember the hills, the foxholes, the faces of the men who'd died beside him, the Italian grandmother who'd called him a better man than the country that sent him, the way the children in liberated villages had looked at him with wonder and joy rather than suspicion and fear. Those memories sustained him through the hard years of the 1950s. Through the civil rights movement of the 1960s, through the slow and painful progress of a nation finally beginning to confront its original sin. In 1983, nearly 40 years after the war, Williams received a letter from Italy. It was from Maria, the young woman who'd worked in the aid station, who'd helped him understand the Italian people he was fighting to liberate. She'd tracked him down through veterans organizations and old military records, determined to find him before it was too late. She wrote about the town where they'd met, about the monument they'd erected to the Buffalo Soldiers, about the annual ceremony they held to honor the men who'd liberated them. She wrote about her children and grandchildren, about the stories she'd told them of the dark angels who'd come from America. And she wrote an invitation. Come back to Italy, see how we remember you. See how the people you liberated honor your sacrifice in ways your own country never has. Williams made the journey in 1984. He flew to Italy, took a train to that small town whose name he'd never quite learned to pronounce. He arrived on the day of their liberation ceremony, elderly now, his hair gray, his body carrying the aches and pains of age and old wounds. The town gathered in the piazza. Children held flowers. Old partisans wore their faded uniforms. And when Private James Williams, Buffalo Soldier, Liberator, hero, walked into that square, the entire town erupted in applause. They cheered for him. They embraced him. They wept and laughed and celebrated his return. The mayor gave a speech about the courage of the black American soldiers, about the sacrifices they'd made, about the humanity they'd shown. A young girl presented Williams with flowers. An old man, a former partisan, saluted him with tears streaming down his face. Williams stood in that piazza, overwhelmed as the Italian people showed him the honor and recognition he'd never received at home. They'd never forgotten. While America had buried the story of the Buffalo Soldiers beneath narratives of failure and racial limitation, Italy had remembered the truth. They'd remembered the courage. So they'd remembered the kindness. They'd remembered that these men had been heroes in every way that mattered. The old woman, Maria's grandmother, was gone now, but her great-grandchildren were there and they knew the story. The dark angels who'd liberated Italy. The soldiers who'd fought 2 wars and somehow impossibly had never lost their humanity. In that moment, standing in an Italian piazza half a world away from Mississippi, Private James Williams finally understood what he'd been fighting for. Not for the country that had sent him to war while denying him basic rights, not for the military command that had blamed him for failures that were never his fault. He'd been fighting for the simple truth that all men are created equal, that courage and character transcend race and nation, that humanity connects us in ways that prejudice can never break. The Italians had seen that truth when his own country couldn't. They'd recognized his sacrifice when America had dismissed it. They'd given him the hero's welcome he'd earned but never received. The story of the Buffalo Soldiers in Italy was buried for decades, overshadowed by the narrative that black soldiers had failed, that the 92nd Division was proof that integration was a mistake. It took years of scholarship, years of veterans speaking their truth, years of Italian testimony before the real story began to emerge. The men of the 92nd Division had fought with courage under conditions that would have broken many units. They'd faced not only a determined enemy, but also the prejudice of their own command structure. They'd been set up to fail, undermined by leaders who didn't believe in them, blamed for systemic failures that had nothing to do with the color of their skin. And still they'd persevered, still they'd fought, Still, they'd shown the world what black soldiers could do when given the chance. The Italian people never forgot. In towns across northern Italy, monuments stand to the Buffalo Soldiers, streets bear their names, museums tell their stories. Every year, Italians gather to remember the dark angels who came from America, who fought with courage, who treated them with respect, who showed them that the color of a man's skin says nothing about the content of his character. These ceremonies continue today, led by Italians who've never met the Buffalo Soldiers but who understand the debt their country owes to these men. They remember what America tried to forget. They honor what America tried to diminish. They keep alive a truth that deserves to be shouted from every mountaintop. The Buffalo Soldiers were heroes, and their courage helped liberate a continent. Private James Williams died in 1991 back home in Mississippi, surrounded by family and carrying with him the memories of two homecomings. The first in 1945 when America had welcomed him back to segregation and discrimination. The second in 1984 when Italy had shown him what it meant to be truly recognized, truly honored, truly seen. He was buried with full military honors, the flag draped over his casket, the same flag he'd fought to defend even when the country it represented had refused to defend him. His children and grandchildren stood at his grave and knew that their grandfather had been a hero, even if it took Italy to show America what that word truly meant. The men who arrived in Italy in 1944, the Buffalo Soldiers who locals couldn't believe they were seeing, weren't just fighting the Germans. They were fighting for recognition, for respect, for the simple truth that black lives matter, that black courage is real, that black soldiers are the equals of any men who've ever worn a uniform. They won that fight, though the victory came too late for many of them to see. They won it in the hearts of the Italian people who never forgot them. They won it in the historical record that finally began to acknowledge their sacrifice. They won it in the legacy they left for future generations of black soldiers who would finally serve in an integrated military, who would finally be judged by their character and courage rather than the color of their skin. The Gothic line was eventually broken. The war in Italy was won. The Buffalo Soldiers played their part in that victory despite everything working against them. And decades later, long after the bullets stopped flying and the artillery fell silent, the truth finally emerged. The men who locals couldn't believe they were seeing, who arrived in Italy carrying the weight of their nation's prejudice, had been heroes all along. Not because they were perfect, not because they never failed or never fell back or never struggled, but because they fought on despite everything, because they showed humanity in the midst of horror, because they proved that courage and character cannot be defined by race. The Italian people saw it immediately. It just took America 70 years to catch up. If this story moved you, please take a second to like this video because it truly helps us keep these untold stories alive. The Buffalo Soldiers who liberated Italy deserve to be remembered, deserve to have their courage recognized, deserve to be honored the way the Italian people have honored them for 80 years. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Tell us what you think about these heroes whose sacrifice was diminished by their own country, but never forgotten by the people they liberated. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel to discover more real stories of black heroes whose courage changed the course of history. These stories matter. These men matter. And the truth, however long it takes to emerge, will always matter most of all.